Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eric Nuro. I am the Stanley Museum of Art's Curio Special Projects. Thank you so much for coming. Before we begin, I am going to play the acknowledgement of the land and sovereignty.
The University of Iowa is located on the homelands
of the Ojibwe and Anishinaabe, Bahoji,
Iowa,
Kickapoo, Ometenewa,
Menominee,
Myaamia,
Miami,
Natuchi,
Missouri,
Omaha, Wazaji,
Osage,
Jaware,
Oto,
Odawa,
Ottawa,
Honka, Potawatomi, Nishnawbe,
Potawatomi,
Nisquaquie, Nemahapi, Sakawaki, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, Sanish, Lubaka, Nuweta.
and the Ho-Chunk Nations.
The following tribal nations: the Omaha tribe of Nebraska and Iowa, Honka tribe of Nebraska, Second Fox Nation of the Mississippi and Iowa, and Winnebago tribe of Nebraska continue to thrive in the state of Iowa, and we continue to acknowledge them.
As an academic institution, it is our responsibility to acknowledge the sovereignty and the traditional territories of these tribal nations,
and the treaties that were used to remove these tribal nations and the histories of dispossession that have allowed for the growth of this institution since 1847.
Consistent with the university's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Understanding the historical and current experiences of Native peoples will help inform the work we do.
Collectively, as a university, to engage in building relationships through academic scholarship, collaborative partnerships, community service, enrollment and retention efforts, acknowledging our past, our present, and future Native nations.
All right, so before we begin today, I want to just take a moment to recognize the Terra Foundation for American Art, which is thanks to their enormous generosity that we are all here today. And I also want to recognize Dr. Jackie Thompson-Rand, who is no stranger to us here at the University of Iowa and Iowa City. Dr. Rand was here for over 20 years, right? Yes, as a professor at the University of Iowa. She is currently the Associate Vice Chancellor for Native Affairs and an Associate Professor at the University of Illinois. Now, Dr. Rand is going to be guest curating a show here at the Stanley Museum that is going to focus on the Stanley's collection of Native American ledger drawings. And as part of the show, and again, this is thanks to the generosity of the Terra Foundation for American Art, there are 2 workshops, and these workshops are intended to help with the conception of the show. So the first workshop is this week, and Dr. Rand and her cohort, it involves a cohort of 5 people. Dr. Rand has assembled a magnificent cohort, and I do want to recognize them as well. Philip Brown, Jennifer New, Erica Presson, Patricia Trujillo, and Mary Youngbear. These 5 people are helping Dr. Rand conceive of the show. And I have been a fly on the wall. I have been privileged enough to be a fly on the wall during their discussions. And I tell you, this show is going to be magnificent. It's going to be August 2023. The show opens in August 2023. We're going to make a lot of noise about it because it's going to be a magnificent show. So you're all going to hear about it. This is the first time you're hearing of it, but trust me, you're going to hear about it over and over again because it is going to be a show worth seeing. And I'm so excited about that. In addition to the cohort, the Terra Foundation generously made way for us to invite George Ironstrack, who is going to be speaking with us today. Now, before George takes the mic from me, I would like to read George's biography, tell you a little bit about George. George Ironstrack has participated in Myaamia language renewal projects as both a student and a teacher since the mid-1990s. Originally from Chicago, George and his family now take their home in Oxford, Ohio. George is a citizen of the Myaamia tribe of Oklahoma and has assisted in the organization and administration of the tribe's I-1 summer educational experience since its inception in 2005. George received his MA in Origins and History of the United States from the Department of History at Miami University. His graduate work centered on the Miami Indian village of Pickawillinie, which was located in Western Ohio near the city of Piqua. George continues to regularly research and write about Myaamia history. Examples of his work can be found on the Myaamia community blog. As both a tribal educator and a former public school teacher, George is also interested in the study of the indigenous pedagogical practices and the ongoing development of Myaamia Ne Kwandingi, which in English translates to Myaamia education. Without any further ado, George Ironstrack.
Okay, anyway. As a former public school teacher, I'm used to putting up with a lot of weirdness in the classroom, but hearing my own voice at a 1 second delay, I couldn't do. Still can't hear me? I can speak really loud. Will that help? Yep. Okay, I'll do that. Check it. I'll switch over to here. Okay. Does this sound? That's better. Test. Okay. Greetings, it's good to see all of you here today. Sorry for the disruptions with the sound. Newe to Jackie Rand for inviting me to come speak with you all today. It's really good to be here, to talk in a small group and to share in a bigger group a story of work in our community with reclamation and revitalization of language and culture. So I'll just do a little more of an introduction to myself in our language in Myaamia Tawenge. Nila Myaamia Metosenia Mime Shike Wenswane. Nehe Sakachakwa Penjewa Palanazwa Nehe Tahkamwa Ila Pikasiane. Myaamia Ewe Makeke Iminute Cheke Nujonge Sipionge Wapangya Kamionge Wapa Shike Sipionge Nila Eminute Che Eminutiane Shikakonge Nunge mehkimwane nia Myaamia nipa yone kaninge Myaamia mishidepane kaninge. So I just wanted to use my language a little bit here in the beginning to introduce you to who I am and where I come from. So I come from the Godfrey and Richardville families from the Myaamia tribe of Oklahoma, the citizen of the Myaamia tribe of Oklahoma. And I have Myaamia kin living in all three of our homelands, which are in the Neosho River Valley in northeastern Oklahoma, the Mirdazine River Valley in eastern Kansas, and in the Wabash River Valley in north central Indiana. Today I'm here to talk to you about our work with Minohsaya, with painted hides, as you see here from this opening image of Chingwea Minohsaya, a Chingwea or Chingwenza painted hide robe that is currently on exhibit in our museum in Myaamia, Oklahoma. This photo comes from a workshop we did this summer. It's a huge team of people working on the Minohsaya team. On the left, you can see everyone's names, and I'll talk about them throughout the presentation. And this summer, we had some guest stars with folks coming from Seneca Country, Michael Galban and Jamie Jacobs, and Laura Pierce coming from the museum world out west and in Canada. Here's a photo of the group. We couldn't capture everyone. Some folks had already left, but you can see some of the faces to go with the names. It's a big group, a lot of fun to work with, and looking forward to seeing where the work goes. So one of the things I really want to emphasize up front is that this is still really early days for our work with painted hides in the Myaamia tribe and Peoria tribes. We started this work during COVID, doing Zoom meetings, and are progressing towards a trip to Paris to visit with the Minohsaya that are currently held in the collections of the Musée de Quai Branly. And then through that process of reconnecting with those robes, then bringing knowledge back to our community. But we haven't yet made that trip. And I want to emphasize, we're early days here. We're still new in what we're doing. So overview today is that I'm going to do a really quick introduction to the Myaamia tribe of Oklahoma, kind of the 10,000-foot view of our community, so you understand the position of this work. Talk about our experience in language and cultural revitalization since the 1990s. And then really briefly summarize our work with a different art form, ribbon work, which we're following as a model for what we're going to do with painted hide work, and then dive into in more depth the reclamation work with Minohsaya with painted hides. So Myaamia tribe of Oklahoma, for those of you who don't know, I know quite a few already know this, so I apologize for any repetition, is located in northeast Oklahoma, what is currently known as Oklahoma, was previously known as Indian Territory, and was previously known as the homelands for many other tribes before that. One of the most diverse places in Indian country in the United States, with nearly 40 tribes in one state. For some folks, a few tribes, they've always been there. For most of us, it's the end result of multiple forced removals. Our little corner of Oklahoma is perhaps the most diverse part of Indian country, with 9 tribes in one county, 8 tribes located in one town that's named after my tribe. The Myaamia is what the town is called, and Ottawa is the county. So many of these groups have been our neighbors for generations, since before contact with Europeans. Some of the groups that are our neighbors today were enemies in the past, but we've since built alliances with them. And others were very, very distant, and we didn't know them, like the Modoc, who were removed from California, Northern California, to Oklahoma. So all of Indian country is interesting. It's very diverse, right? And so I encourage folks to come visit if you haven't. It's a very interesting part of Indian country. Our population centers today, as I said, I've got Myaamia relatives in 3 main river valleys in northeastern Oklahoma, where our sovereign tribe is based, where our trust land is located, in eastern Kansas, where our first reservation was after our first forced removal, and in our traditional homelands in north central Indiana. So those are our 3 largest population centers. We have citizens living in 46 other states. Our homelands, as I said, center on the Wabash River Valley in north central Indiana, but we include not just the heartland of our homelands when we think about Myaamia, but all the spaces that our ancestors lived. And so this map, I would say, is still not accurate in my view, in that the edges are too sharp. I like to think of, once you move west of the Mississippi, there's still information, but it starts to get fuzzier. And so when you go south of the Ohio River, or you go east of the Scioto, or the north of the St. Mary's or St. Joseph's into Michigan, what is Michigan today. But these are the spaces that our language shows us we moved and lived. So this is the landscape as our language shows it. Every place we have in our language, we put onto this map. And so, as you can see, it's a riverine environment, and our lives centered on rivers, which is not surprising. Our beginning as a people, we have our oldest story, our story of emergence that begins Myaamia nipingon jisa kachwe chike hon jisa kachwe wache sakiwe ongi itaminge. At first, the Myaamia came out of the water, and the place where they came out is called the coming out place. That location for us is in the what is called in English, the St. Joseph's River Valley, the St. Joseph's of Michigan. In our language, it's Sakiwe Sipe. And that's in between South Bend and Lake Michigan here in Indiana and southern Michigan. That's where our people began, our arrival in our homelands. And then later on, we have stories about moving south into the Wabash River Valley and settling our heartlands. And the white dots mark our permanent villages. Where I work today is on the edges of our traditional homelands in southwestern Ohio at Myaamia Mishdepondekanninge at the Big Miami Schoolhouse or Miami University. The university is named for the river valleys, which were named for us. So we say that we share the same name as the university. But of course, it's not a nation state, right? There are lots of other tribes in that space. It's hard to pick a point in time to say, and this is where they lived at this particular time. So I arbitrarily decided right before our first treaty with the United States in 1794, this is a proximate position of many of our relatives and other tribes, based on treaties and other documents that show folks' location. So you can see it's a robust shared environment. Everyone had their own heartlands. And for the most part, people lived at peace with each other and negotiated sharing of resources in the hunting and gathering and trade. We say we lived in this space from time immemorial outside of a few disruptive moments in our history until the end of about a decade and a half of warfare with the newly born United States. The price of peace in 1795 was that we give up a part of our homeland. So we ceded the land where I work today at Miami University at the First Treaty of Greenville. And then the 50 years that followed under heavy oppression, we ceded most of the rest of our homelands, or other tribes ceded parts of land that we used to consider ours, but the U.S. government didn't have us at the table when the land was ceded. So by 1840, we had ceded most of our collective land in our traditional homelands. I always have to be very clear and point out we have an existing land claim in Illinois for land that we did not cede. But at this time, our people couldn't actively access that land. They were being physically separated from it. That treaty in 1840 also agreed in principle to removal. And so in 1846, as a result of that treaty, the U.S. federal Indian agent called in the army to Peru, Indiana, and forcibly rounded up over 300 people and began the process of forced relocation, or deportation, as some are calling it today, to the edge of the unorganized territories before it was the Kansas and Nebraska territory. At that time, 150 people, including members of my own family, were legally allowed to remain behind in Indiana under terms of treaties and legislation. After the end of the Civil War, that process repeated itself. So we had built a new nation, a new reservation in eastern Kansas. After the Civil War, that land was allotted, divided up, and then under terms of an omnibus treaty after the Civil War, the tribe agreed to relocate to Indian Territory, what is today Oklahoma. In that process as well, about 30 individuals were allowed to remain behind in Kansas. So the tribe became fragmented into 3 populations that we still see today. I want to emphasize here, right, there's fragmentation of people now, 3 main populations, really small pockets. So 150, about 30, and just over 100 in Oklahoma at the end of the second removal, so a small population. And there's fragmentation of land. So the land in Indiana had been divided up into individual family reserves. The land in Kansas has been divided up through, you could call it allotment. It's a pre-Dawes Act era, but it's still basically allotment. And eventually, not under the Dawes Act, but under a separate act that built off of the Dawes Act, our reservation in what is today Oklahoma was also allotted by the end of the 1880s. So you have fragmentation of land and fragmentation of people. And by the 20th century, many of the children of this era and their children have to leave the reservations, the former reservation lands, to find just survival, right? So we end up all over the country. So that fragmented population leads us to where we are today with nearly 7,000 citizens with those 3 main population centers, but people living spread out internationally as well as in 46 other states. So I'm really hitting this notion of diaspora for our community because it's a key educational challenge we face today. And so that comes into play when we're talking about our work with ribbon work and our plan for developing work around Minohsaya for painted robes. In here, of course, is the story that, again, is shared with a lot of tribes of the experience of our children during this period of fragmentation and loss. The children are also being pulled out of homes and taken to boarding schools or attending day schools just on or off reservation. But the experience that they're having in those schooling environments, as a teacher, I would classify as educational abuse. Most of our kids by this period were multilingual. They spoke English and they spoke our language and usually another tribal language, but they were treated as though they should become monolingual English speakers only, and they were trained to perceive their own culture as, not worthy of survival into the 20th century. This had, deep costs for our community. Many young people left the community in this period. So in this graduating class from Haskell, only this young man here, only Wapi Mangwa, is Myaamia. And he then left the community after graduating and went to work for the federal government in the Indian service. And to the best we can tell, he never came back to community. So what happened to him is what the government wanted. They wanted young people to leave their communities and go, quote unquote, where the work is and be absorbed into society like immigrants. Right? And then through that force of assimilation, the tribal nation would cease to exist. Thankfully, that didn't happen, but certainly our nation was greatly weakened. And by the early 20th century, our language was not being taught to children under 5. So linguists would say that our language became moribund. And by the 1960s, the last speakers of our language passed away, and our language entered a period of dormancy. We say in our community, we say our language went to sleep, and it was silent and asleep until the 1990s. This is a really 10,000-foot view, so I'm happy to take questions at the end if I glossed over something that interests you. There's this period of rebuilding that begins in the worst part of the Great Depression for our community. And it takes a long time, but the first kind of roots, seeds are planted as we reorganize our government and gain some economic control again. In the 60s and 70s, a landless tribe, we begin to reacquire parts of our reservation again. And then in the 1990s, we're able to open our first casino, working together with the Modoc tribe in Myaamia, Oklahoma. And that's the first time we have money that we can actually say should go to education the way we define education, right? So previously, the kind of grant-related funds we were getting from the government had heavy restrictions on how they could be used. The casino monies, which still were heavily restricted in their use, had specific ability to employ them for language and culture education. So it was the first time we could run our own language and culture programs with monies, the economic foundation of the tribe being strengthened. It's no coincidence that shortly after in 2000, we form our first cultural resource office, and the Myaamia Center where I work, which is the research arm of the Cultural Resource Office, was founded in 2001. A year later. So all these are long steps that I'm kind of flying over, but I'm going to emphasize the last 2 and their impact on community throughout the next parts of the presentation. So this process that begins with language revitalization, we call today picking up the threads of our knowledge, so that when we walk our youth through this practice, when we begin each of our programs for the week, is that we talk about how there's this web of kinship that connects us all as Myaamia people. And what makes up that web are various aspects of the things we do as a community. And that through our historical experience, some of those elements of the web were weakened and they fell to the ground, or they kind of sagged. And now we as a people are in a period of our history where we can pick them up and tighten them again, or weave in new threads and add them to the web to make us strong again. And we talk about how the web has then changed over time. We're not trying to become our ancestors. We're trying to strengthen our community using the best of what our ancestors left us so that we can leave the best we can for the next generation. So the web physically changes in the activity, and they can feel the vibrations of the other people in the web. They can feel their connections. But getting to this point took a lot of work, some of which I was there for, some of which I wasn't. So I said our language went silent. We sort of have two strands, two threads that lead to us being able to speak our language again in a communicative fashion. The first is that the director of the Myaamia Center, Daryl Baldwin, wanted to teach his children to speak our language, but he didn't even know if our language was spoken by anyone. And so he, through his father, began to seek someone in the community who could teach, and he didn't find anyone. But what he did find were family papers that had word lists and phonetic explanations for how to pronounce the words. And so he began in a rudimentary fashion at first to speak the language to his children in a communicative way. On the West Coast, at University of California, Berkeley, the current director of the Myaamia Center's Office of Linguistics randomly got assigned our language as his dissertation topic, much to our great luck. And when he began his work, he repeated the same process Daryl did. He went to Oklahoma, he went to Indiana. He didn't find any living speakers, but he did find eventually 19 total written sources about our language. No audio recordings, except for one minor audio recording, but did find a wealth of written materials that begin in the French period in the late 1600s, as you can see, and comes all the way through the really professionally trained linguistic era of the early 20th century. So multiple languages, French, Latin, Myaamia or Miami, Illinois, and English are in all these manuscripts. This material, David and other linguists continue to process to be able to create teaching materials for us as a community. So Daryl eventually gets recruited to be a community teacher, and his knowledge of community teaching gets combined with David's knowledge of linguistics to be able to create more and more robust communicative teaching materials where, there's hundreds of people who speak our language on a daily basis now, and probably 50 or so who can communicate in a pretty robust way with some confidence. Which is, for us, really big progress. So here's an example of one of those materials. This is the Boulanger manuscript. And you can see here the entry for homme or human. And you can see, like, for us, this is Eleniwa or Elenia, man or human. And the word I used in my introduction, Minohsaya or Minohsaya, which means like the people or human beings. And then you can see lots of other information. So these texts are really rich in terms of their ability to help us understand our language, the way it was spoken and changed over time, how it was spoken, but also cultural information. So connecting directly to our talk today, this is the entry for the word Minohsaya, or the plural Minohsayake, which is painted hides, is how we say it in English, but you can see David transcribed the French here and translated that into English, or David and his team, I should say. So this is a part of a database where we can search terms. So I could go and I could search painted hide and find this entry. So we find this term, Minohsaya, that was only used in this earlier period. And when you move out of the French, with these French dictionaries in the early 1700s, you don't find the term anymore. And so you see a lot of references to painted hides in the 16 and 1700s, and then it falls dormant. The art form falls dormant because other art forms, we think, came to supplant it. So one of those art forms that I'm going to touch on as an example is ribbon work. So ribbons, they are sewn, is how we call ribbon work. And ribbon work is an art form for us of creating geometric patterns by layering, cutting, folding, and sewing ribbons to create really elaborate geometric patterns. And this is a picture from a workshop that we did at Miami University with college students as a part of this ongoing work to revitalize ribbon work after years of work to reclaim the knowledge of ribbon work from the archives. Here's an example of a really fine pair of ribbon work moccasina that are held by the Cranbrook Institute of Science. So you can see the complicated patterns, and I'll talk about this more. We call this effect that the ribbon work achieves, wawasinakwake, or shimmering. When you stare at it long enough, the diamonds start to dance. It plays tricks in your eyes, especially if you're under artificial lighting. It gets really wonky. I start to blink and kind of shake my head when I'm staring at it. Sometimes it's really, really interesting. And one of the reasons why you get this effect is because of the interplay between positive and negative spaces that the artists are intentionally building as they create these designs. And the relative lack of imprecision of the points. So they're not exactly precise, which your eye then wants them to be precise. And so it creates this kind of havoc in your vision the longer you stare at them. And this, there's some pieces that look like, to me, when under the right lighting circumstances, they look like LEDs. So the leggings on the right here, when you stare at them long enough, they start to go back and forth. Like, it's really impressive the degree to which they're creating these effects. And for us, we believe that, when your relatives helped clothe you in these garments and you were wearing silverwork and a white silk shirt or a white linen shirt, and you were standing outside in the natural sunlight and you were speaking at a treaty, it was like a spotlight on you. People couldn't look away. And so it's this visual sign of the love and care that your family has for you, but also you pay attention to this person because of the aura of shimmering that surrounds them. So here's some older pictures of folks from the late 1800s. This is Unza Zhinikwa, a real tough Myaamia auntie who outlived 5 husbands, I think. And this, it's hard to count because the photo doesn't have good resolution, but we think it's 60 layers of ribbons on the end of her wrap skirt. And then here's a good example of the combination of the ribbons plus silver work. So these are tarnished, but these were all silver brooches, so they would have sparkled in the sun. And one of her descendants wearing a wrap skirt at a reenactment or a pageant. So really good examples of Wawas and Akwake, the combination of silver work and ribbon work. Like our language, we had a period of loss from ribbon work where, poverty becomes endemic in the nation, and the families that are the last ones to hold on to these family heirlooms are forced to sell them to collectors because they need the money. In many cases, while Benaki Kapwa here, Gabriel Godfrey, literally to fund the legal fight to protect his land from illegal seizure and back taxes. So you can see them holding here the family collection of ribbons. And here's just an example of that collection process, which was well documented, right? So it's the tragic thing about this era is that people were literally documenting what they were doing. And you can see here, one pair of ribbonwork moccasins, a part of a $12 lot here. And then there's one set where it says, ribbonwork leggings, partially unmade, so you can see how the process works. Sort of the balance of this is that all these objects that were collected, many of them ended up in big collections like NMAI. And when we were ready, we could go seek them out and reconnect with them. And so here is Carolyn Niles, older sister of our cultural resource officer, Julie Olds, visiting with a pair of women's leggings in Suitland, Maryland at the Cultural Resource Center as a part of one of these trips to photograph, look at, pick up, look around, figure out how these objects were made and, what colors are there, sort of deep investigations by research teams. And then that knowledge, it took years, beginning in the 1990s with some of the first trips to look at ribbon work all the way through the mid-2000s. And then with help from the National Endowment for the Arts, we created a program to transform that knowledge into programs to teach ribbon work in community. So all that work in bringing knowledge back to a few only produced a couple of ribbon workers who were really good, but it was just a couple. And the goal was we've reclaimed the knowledge, now we want to revitalize the practice in community. And so here, I love this photo because it's 3 generations of Myaamia. Grandmother, her grandson, and her daughter behind, all working on a ribbon work project at a workshop. So through these workshops, everyone left with a finished piece of ribbon work. They all could call themselves ribbon workers when they were finished. And then the growth and practice of ribbon work has expanded in community, as well as the knowledge of what the ribbon work means, right? So there's the doing, there's the language, and then there's the meaning behind the ribbon work, especially aspects of wrapping your loved ones and showing care for them. And then ribbon work shows up in all different multiple forms today. So kind of classic place in Myaamia events or intertribal events, a ribbon-worked ribbon shirt, right? Pretty typical place to see it. But also on graduation stoles that we give to our graduates at Myaamia University. So, not a whole blanket, but we're wrapping them and showing our care for them as they graduate, to a medal that the Myaamia University president wears when he speaks at functions at Myaamia University, to moccasin game pads for moccasin eyungi mehkindingi, the moccasin game, which many Great Lakes tribes play. And then through this process, we've also learned that the geometric patterns that show up in ribbon work pre-existed ribbon work. right? We shouldn't be surprised, but for us, that was information that had gone dormant in our community. And so just as geometric patterns aren't the only, ribbonwork's not the only place the geometric patterns existed, for us, then we've begun to breathe life into the geometric patterns being in other places. So t-shirts, especially, license plates, even a clock that one of our business committee members designed. And increasingly in our community, I don't have any good photos of them, our young people are getting tattoos with geometric patterns on them. So our research, this is going to take us back towards hide painting now. Our research into ribbon work led us towards this path of recognizing where these geometric patterns show up other than in cut and folded ribbons. And so you see like this early drawing from Louis Nicholas from the Codex Canadensis, this Inoka, this Illinois war leader who has these designs that are either paint or tattoos or some combination of them likely on his body, as well as wearing a toga, which is Louis Nicholas is not a very good artist. Is a terribly drawn, probably painted hide robe that he's wearing over one shoulder. But you can see there's geometric designs on there too. But I would say the tattoos are not very well designed, not very well depicted. A better example actually comes from the Meskwaki. This is a famous drawing that people use painting because the tattoos are so nicely articulated, much better artistry in depicting the tattoos. And you can really see the geometric designs showing up at this Meskwaki man from the 1700s. And we have good text descriptions of Myaamia tattoos looking the same, or looking very similar. We also see it in weavings. This object was in the collected list that I showed earlier, and they just called it, what did he call it? Like a ball of twine bag is what he called it. And this is like an amazing piece of twine artwork that has certainly degraded a little bit, but it's jaw-dropping, the artistry, and it just gets called like twine bag or something like that in the description. But you can see here the geometric patterns that are created. And there is some post-contact material in here, some black wool, but everything that is done here could have been done pre-contact as well. There are plenty of examples. And here's the reverse side of it, also showing geometric designs. Geometric designs show up in hide applique. And this is also pre-contact, although this piece is post-contact and shows also ribbon work, but we see hide applique creating geometric patterns on multiple pieces, and it shows up in paintings as well. And so this is from the edge of an atas SEMA from a set of leggings. These leggings show ribbon work as well, but the ribbon work degraded. So they were worn a lot for pageants in Indiana, as people kind of performed Indianness for their white neighbors for basically admission, for ticket admission. So these were worn a lot, and the ribbons were worn off, but the hide applique endured. It's much tougher material. And then kind of mixed forms here, another mixed form, you have ribbon work together with quill work. Which quill work, again, could be used to create very small geometric patterns. But those patterns weren't visible at a distance because it would just kind of disappear and pixelate. So the ribbon work, one of the things that ribbon work did is it allowed you to create bigger geometric designs than quill work allowed. And then to the Minohsaya, to the painted hides. So many of us who've been working in Myaamia art revitalization have been looking at pictures of these painted hides, these Minohsaya, for over a decade. And we've recognized just how important they are, just how beautiful they are. And we recognized how much they connect to ribbon worked wearing blankets and wrap skirts that we see in our community in the middle 1800s. We've wanted very much to connect with them more than just at a distance, and to figure out how we can bring the knowledge and the stories that are likely inherent in these objects back into community. So the four that I'm going to show are all held by the Musée de Quai Branly in Paris. And this is a Chingwea or Chingwenza Minohsaya. Chingwea in our community, thunder being. We have some stories of Chingwea. We have many more stories of Chingwenzake, of the young thunder beings. And in many of those stories, the young thunder beings, Chingwenzake, they interact with us, and they give us gifts and oftentimes allow us to transform into them. And so when I look at this Minohsaya, I think of those stories of the Chingwenzake and the events that lead them to places like Chingwatanonge, like Niagara Falls, and the people that they gave their feathers to as a powerful form of interaction. Others of the painted hides are much more abstract, but we have thoughts about ways in which they connect to things that we did as a community and things we still do as a community. So we recognize that there's things we understand about the hides, the Minohsaya, and there's things we don't. And this one's a bit of an outlier. Its forms are a little different and its coloration is a little different, but most folks believe it's a part of the same set. And this one, folks kind of believe is an abstracted animal, just is interesting, perhaps connected to bison. The strange thing about the abstraction of the bison, though, is that all these hides, to the best of our knowledge, are on deer skin, on Myaamia, not on bison skin. So, turning to the work this summer, we had realized these hides were in Europe, and we wanted to connect with them. And through a series of fortuitous events, we connected with a scholar at University of Illinois named Bob Morrissey. And Bob was able to work together with us to submit a grant to the Humanities Without Walls work at University of, well, it's a consortium, but it's centered at University of Illinois, funded by Mellon. And that grant, which we call Reclaiming Stories, is going to fund work going forward to more fully reconnect with the hides in Europe and to bring that knowledge back into a programming setting in Myaamia, in Miami lands. And as a first step, we wanted to connect with Michael Galban, who came recommended to teach hide painting. We wanted to get initial steps to just understand the basics of hide painting. And so Michael came with his friend and colleague, Jamie Jacobs, to Myaamia, Oklahoma this summer. And he's, as you can see, he works at Ganundigan State Historical Site in New York. Teach us about not just hide painting, but also thinking through more carefully our understanding of geometric patterns and other patterns that show up in Indigenous art across the Great Lakes. And one of the conversations that we had is about understanding these designs as a part of a palette that moved from the human body in the form of tattoos to painted hides, to other surfaces like wood that could be painted with designs, that there was a connection between the iconography showing up in all those places, as though it's not one continuous palette, but one interconnected palette. The main difference that really has struck me, and it's the reason it's a part of the title of the talk, is that Minohsaya are functionally different for us as Myaamia people from ribbon work because they're connected to land in a different way. So one of the painful things about ribbon work is that ribbon work reaches its first peak. I say first peak because I think we're heading towards a second peak of the beauty of the art form. It reaches its first peak in the 1820s and 1830s when we're at the height of land loss. And what we see in part is that the treaty monies that are coming into the community from land treaties are being used to purchase materials like silk ribbons to create ribbon work. And people have the time in that moment when they're getting these treaty monies to sit and make these beautiful, complex garments. But it's tied to a moment, and that moment passes, and poverty enters the community, and people are no longer able to do that, and then they're sold out. So there's this connection to loss with ribbon work for us, and the loss of land. But for Minohsaya, everything comes from the land. So silk ribbon and the materials that go into making ribbon work all come through trade. They come from outside of our community. The knowledge and the forms come from within us, but everything else, the material, comes from without. But for Minohsaya, almost everything can come from within our lands. So thinking about the paint, right? Michael walked us through, where he harvests hematite. And the various other kinds of minerals you can harvest to begin making your paints from. So alamune in our language, or ocher, can be found in our homelands, possibly in all three homelands today. You can see here another picture of alamune, of powdered hematite, a nice kind of robust red color, which was, for most communities in the Great Lakes, red was the favorite color to use. Still really important today, almost in some cases like religiously important, cosmologically important for Great Lakes peoples. And, a sign of that here is this is the Unzala Munisipiwe, the yellow paint river in what is today Illinois, right? And the understanding is along this river, there are deposits of yellow ochre that hopefully we can still harvest. This is a part of the work we have yet to do. There are other rivers also called Paint River or Vermilion River on our homelands. And the belief is there's also ochre in those river valleys for us to find and harvest. And then he worked with us to create a tesakane paint, which is created by adding a binding agent to the powdered mineral materials. Across North America, binding agents usually came from animal proteins. So from scraping the inside of hides and boiling it down and creating hide glue, or from eggs. So a lot of people in the Great Lakes used fish eggs. For this, we just used chicken eggs. That was what was available in Myaamia, Oklahoma easily, so that's what we used. But the idea being, as we continue to build this out, we'll be more intentional about harvesting from our lands for the binding material. And then, of course, the Minohsaya, the brain tanned and smoked deer hide. Right? For this occasion, we worked with folks that Michael knew who had prepared brain tanned and smoked hides that he felt were of the right quality. But in the future, the goal is in our community to actually hunt. We have, of course, hunters in our community who hunt deer every fall, to hunt deer Musa on our lands, right? To treat them in the way we believe we should treat these animals that we've had a long relationship with, and then process those animals ourselves, brain tan them using their own brains and smoke them on our lands to create the kinds of materials we want to paint. And then when we paint hides together as a community, it's less of an individual act of an individual artisan and more of a collective act of a community working together to create a piece of artwork, to create Minohsaya, a painted hide, which we can gift. I think that's one of the most primary uses we can see right now, is they can be very important gifts our community can give, but also can become things that we use in community. So here's a sample. There are a couple of people in the workshop this summer who are very good artists. And I felt much shame painting on my piece of hide, looking over at what they were doing. But we used a mix of bone tools and wooden tools to paint. And here you see another chingwea or chingwenza painted on a piece of a hide. The finished product from that workshop was a SEMA bag, a kemotaye. And so every participant had a finished bag by the time we finished. So it took about 2 days to do the whole workshop, and everyone left with a finished bag. Some really beautiful like this, some more clumsy like mine, but all of them smelling really good. Smoked hide is fun to work with. But then we also got to play around as a group. And I think this is really important in terms of the creative process. And we got to play around in ways that we won't get to in Paris when we finally are able to make that trip. We're lucky enough in our museum to have 2 painted hides that were donated to us by a community member's spouse. And these were produced by non-native artists, but we view them as a part of a teaching collection. So we can put them on display, but we can also pick them up and try them on. So there's lots of debate about how these hides were worn. Well, rather than engaging in sort of an academic debate on paper, Michael Gavin was like, well, let's go to the archive and let's pick one of them up and let's put it on. I can show you how I think it was worn. And so then he showed us how you could wear it like a toga, like that Illinois leader was probably wearing it, where it's over one shoulder and pinned under another. And we have lots of examples of wearing blankets worn this way in the 1800s. And when you do that, it correctly positions chingwenza on your back, which one of the leading scholars in Europe on these says that chingwenza, that chingwea robe, was worn in a way that would position chingwea's head going sideways, which feels very culturally wrong to us. And yet he's like arguing it in an academic paper. So it was very interesting to actually go and try it on. Now it's a little stiff from being on display, so it's not as supple as they would have been, when they were worn regularly. But it was really interesting to try them on and to be kind of super silly sometimes, right? To have fun and play around with it a little bit in a safe way, so we can get a feel for, each other as human beings, but also the materials that we're working with. And so this is Liz Ellis, who's a Peoria citizen. On the left, my younger brother, Scott Shoemaker, who's a Myaamia tribe citizen, in the center, and me playing the fool with the Pakamalkane with the war club on the right. So I want to just take a moment and make sure that I acknowledge all the team members, and especially want to recognize the work that the Peoria tribe and the Myaamia tribe of Oklahoma have done in supporting this work. So as I already mentioned, we have a Peoria member of the team in Elizabeth Ellis. We also have Charlotte Echohawk on the team, who's their cultural preservation officer, and Wesley Farless, who's their language teacher. And then on the Myaamia side of the team, Julie Olds, who's our cultural resource officer, and has been at the center of our cultural resource work in terms of revitalization for 20 plus years. And on the Myaamia Center side, non-tribal, they're not tribal folks, but Dr. Cameron Shriver, who works at Myaamia University, and Dr. David Costa, who also works at Myaamia University. And then Dr. Jack Green, who heads up the art museum at Myaamia University, where eventually we'll be doing an exhibition tied to this work. And Jason Shaman, who's the curator of exhibitions at Myaamia University. And I missed one more Peoria citizen, Logan Pappenfort, who's former second chief of the Peoria tribe, but now is the acting director and curator of archaeology at the Illinois State Museum at Dixon Mounds. And great help in terms of consulting on this project has been Laura Pierce, who's a former curator of collections at the Pitt Rivers Museum. And again, to thank Michael Galban and Jamie Jacobs for their help this summer. If you want to learn more about the Myaamia tribe or Peoria tribe, there's our home pages. And then our community blog, Achimota Tiangwe, will continue to have more stories about this work. I put a tiny URL in there in case that's easier for anyone. And then there's a homepage for our work at Reclaiming Stories that Bob Morrissey set up. So Missionewe again to the Myaamia tribe of Oklahoma, the Peoria tribe of Indians of Oklahoma, and Humanities Without Walls for funding this work, and to the Terra Foundation for bringing me here today. And again, to Jackie and the staff of the Stanley Art Museum for facilitating my visit. So if there's still time, I can take questions.
I was wondering, how much collaborative work did you do with the other tribes surrounding, with the language and with the ribbon work? Was there any overlap? Because this language has to be really similar if you're that close.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll repeat it just for folks who are on Zoom. So the question was, how much collaboration did we do with other tribes around us about language and as well about ribbon work? That's a really good question. So the language is similar enough to Meskwaki and Sauk and Kickapoo that there's a lot of help that we got, especially early on. So Darrow was good friends with a Kickapoo speaker and went to him with a lot of questions early on to help us understand things, especially how to talk about new things, because our language went dormant in the early 1920s, 1930s. How did they all decide to name a car? How do you talk about putting gas in the car? These kind of questions about practical language use. So folks like that were a great help. And we still, when we hit kind of a roadblock, we'll go to folks there or on the other side of the language family to Ojibwe and Potawatomi speakers to ask for help. So a lot of help, especially early on. And then with ribbon work, yes, especially, and I'm going to blank on her name, I feel really bad. There was a Delaware ribbon work artist who really helped the first two of our artists learn the basics of ribbon work. The Delaware patterns were really different from ours at that point. They had transitioned more to floral style ribbon work, but she still knew tons to help them. And it was really key. I think it was Paula Pachonik was her name, that helped Scott and Karen sort of gain early understanding of ribbon work. That was really important and vital for us. Yeah, anyway, good question. Other questions?
I'm really fascinated with this concept of Wawasnakwaki. Did I get that right?
Wawasnakwaki, yeah.
So close, but not right. There's just, I'm trying to think about ways that there's so many connections to neuroscience there, because that's a neurological effect that happens. And it's one that we've noticed in our wall. that we created unintentionally, that indeed you can't look away from, you know? I don't know where I was going with that, just that I think it's really cool, you know, and I like, so as you are creating new patterns, you're renewing this pattern work. Is your goal the same, you know, to create work that creates a spotlight for people? And do you find that is it working?
Yep. So anyway, that's a really good question. I'll repeat it again. So the question was recognizing the shared, like all of humans are sort of entranced by this shimmering effect because it's a neurological phenomenon that all humans are susceptible to. And yet, right, we all have our unique ways of manifesting it. And so the question was, you know, are we teaching that and seeking it in our work today, or how has it changed? And yes, so we're very much teaching the concept. Ribbon workers are, of course, free to create the way they want to create, but especially for those who are dancing at powwows, they really seem to try and seek this effect. And one change that we see, at least, I've heard I do a little bit of ribbon work, but I wouldn't consider myself a ribbon worker, that they tend to be moving towards bigger diamonds because it can be better seen at a farther distance. And the smaller you go, you can create more elaborate vibrations or shimmering, but it's lost as soon as you're too far away. And so the powwow environment leads them to want to have it be a little more bold and robust so it can be seen at a distance. That's one change. I don't know, what other directions it will go. That's one of the fun things about revitalizing in community is then you kind of turn it back over to the community and then it's up to them. What are they going to do with it?
That is fascinating.
Yes, Jackie.
So does that have that shimmering does that have any ceremonial purposes?
That is a good question. I'll repeat it again. So the question was, does the Walwala as a shimmering effect have ceremonial purposes? I'm almost certain it did. It's an area that I don't have enough knowledge to speak to with any kind of certainty, in terms of how, but that kind of manifestation of visual power, I know from other places it must have had, yes. But I right now I'm an infant crawling along, and I can see the shape of something, but I can't tell you more than that. But great question.
It makes sense, right?
With the trip to Paris, is there any discussion about repatriation? Is that even in the talk?
There is currently no discussion of repatriation. Yeah, I think there's always in European museum circles. Sorry, I should repeat the question. The question was, is there talk about repatriation with the Minohsaya? And currently, no, there's no talk about repatriation. What we're trying to reclaim is knowledge. And what we want to do is connect objects, Minohsaya. So this is something interesting about language, right? Minohsaya is a word that ends in "ah" in our language, and all words that end in "ah" are important. So all human beings end in "ah", all animals end in "ah", all solar bodies end in "ah", many weather phenomena end in "ah". It's like, it means that this isn't just a normal object, right? But they've been disconnected from the stories, and that's what we want to do. We want to reconnect the stories that give those things layered meaning in community. And what comes after that, we don't know at this point.
I just want to make sure I understand clearly the development of the ribbon practice among Miami practitioners as something that you characterize distinctively from surrounding nations that where ribbon work embodied loss in relation to the loss of land. And if I understood you correctly, you characterized it in this context as something different. Did I understand you correctly because of the use of indigenous materials separate from trade with the outside, with traders? Is that basically the correct interpretation?
Let me just repeat the question. So the question was, the statement I made about ribbon work being connected to loss, that's different from what other tribes are experiencing, and different from other art forms because all the materials are coming through trade and purchase from the outside. So the first part, I was definitely making that point about the difference between Minohsaya, where all the materials come from your land, and the whole artistic production, I don't like that word in English, in Myaamia, I don't think of it that way, but the whole Minohsaya can be created together as a community in your place, compared to ribbon work, where all the materials from the wool backing to the thread to the thimbles are all coming from outside your community. That is the difference. I'm not staking a claim to our community's experience with ribbon work being different from other tribes. In fact, I see in that same period, 1820s, 1830s, a lot of similarities. Where we're different today is how we've all kind of changed our ribbon work practices over time. And so now people can look at a set of ribbon work leggings and say, oh yeah, those are Osage, and those are Delaware, and those are Ojibwe. But like, I can't do that. And in the 1820s, I think it's even harder to differentiate what's what, because there's so much shared similarity. My guess is shared similarity and loss too, but I don't ever speak for other tribal communities. And I don't know their stories well enough, but I would guess so many people are experiencing loss in that period.
But when these objects are made from the land, could you call them in a sense, or think of them as landscapes themselves, or are they land, or are they objects, or objects? Is there a difference between that, those spheres? Yeah,
that's a really good question. So as Minohsaya are created from the land, do they become landscapes themselves, or are they a part of the landscape? That is, so my answer here is as an individual person in my community. So I'm not speaking for all community, because I said this is really new. We don't have a shared conception. We're going to have to engage in the practice for a while to be able to answer that question from a community perspective. But as a teacher working with my youth and community, what I see is the Minohsaya are an extension of our homelands in the same way I am an extension of my homelands, the same way the Musa that we hunt there is an extension of our homelands. So they're not landscapes, but they are rooted in landscape to a degree that some people might say, okay, that's landscape then. But we wouldn't, at this time, I don't think we would describe it that way.
So from what I'm understanding, reclaiming this you're trying to teach a lot about like what it was like traditionally. Do you think that the symbolism has changed or is changing with this artwork?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So the question is, as we teach this practice, we try and focus on, how it was at a given point in time in the past. As we teach it today, does the meaning behind the symbols change? And, if so, what do we know about that so far? That's like the toughest question right now for us. So reclaiming stories for us is going to take a lot more work to begin. And some of it involves historical imagination, which at least the way I was trained as a historian, some people are kind of nervous about. But there in some cases, there are no texts to turn to. And it's going to take people, community looking at something, spending time with it and deciding, we think this might mean this, and then just kind of moving forward with that highly educated guess. So yes, there's going to be a lot of change. But what we hope happens is that through time, then as the practice grows, it will become grounded in experience that everyone understands, and that will become the new story that surrounds Minohsaya, is the stories we create today. And certainly the symbolism will change.
Just one more question. Are there any examples of artwork involved in your projects that are in museums that involve protected information that are subject to restrictions, protected by NAPRA, for example, where some objects may not be appropriate for certain audiences?
Yes. Yeah, certainly. In terms of what we know currently about the Minohsaya, none of them fall into that category, as I say, as we understand now. But yeah, certainly in the collections of NMAI in Cranbrook Institute, there are objects that we would view as like restricted and have to be treated with a lot of care. And for instance, we wouldn't want young children around them, people of childbearing age, those kinds of separations and care would be taken with those objects. Yeah.
It sounds like that's it. Thank you, everyone, for
Okay.
attending, and thank you, Professor Ironstrack, for your talk today.
Yeah. No, check it out. Anyway.